Hi there, in this video we'll be discussing the synchronic preparation in bitKlavier. So to get synchronic, you press Action, Add, Synchronic, or you can just press S, SSS. And once we have synchronic, we link it up to the key map, Command, Click, Drag. So without synchronic, we'll delete it. This is how our keyboard sounds. And then when we get synchronic, S, Command, Click, Drag, this is what it sounds like. So as you can hear, it essentially repeats the note you're playing. So when we open up synchronic, we can see there are 3 pages. We're not going to be talking about this page today. We'll come to that in a later video, but for now we'll talk about these 2 main pages. So starting on this page, right at the top we have number of pulses. So that's how many times synchronic repeats the note you play. So right now I'll play a note, then it'll repeat for 20 times, which is many times. So let's bring it down to 4. And so I'll play a note and then it'll repeat 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can drag it all the way up or all the way down. You can also type in numbers, 20. You can type in a number bigger than 100, 900. Now when you drag it, it'll be a whole different scale, but if you write a number smaller than 100, then the scale will return back to 1 to 100. The next one is number of layers. So you'll notice that, let's bring this up to 5. When I play a note, and then play another note, only the most recent note is repeated. That's because number of layers is 1. If I make number of layers 2, then 2 notes can be repeated at the same time. Or you can bring that all the way up to 10, or write in a big number. Let's write in 100, put 100 here, see what happens. So you can get a whole big cacophonous thing just using those 2 parameters, which is pretty freaking cool. Let's bring that up to 5. All right, moving down the line, cluster thickness is how many notes of a given chord that you play are repeated. So if you bring it down to 1, for example, if I play any chord of any size, only 1 note will be repeated. 3-note chord, only 1 note. 2-note chord, 1 note. 4-note chord, 1 note. You can bring that up to 3, and I'll play a 4-note chord, and only 3 notes will be repeated. But if I make it 4, then they'll all be repeated. Again, you can drag or type in a number. Gain is how loud the repeated notes will be. So if it's at 1, it's as loud as the note I play, same volume. If it's bigger, then the repeated notes will be louder. If it's smaller than 1, then they'll be quieter. Let's bring it back to 1. Cluster threshold determines what a cluster is, and this number is in milliseconds. So this is how long it takes me to play multiple notes. So if I do this, for example, those 2 notes, was considered a cluster because they took place in the time of 500 milliseconds. But if I make cluster threshold 60 milliseconds, that's not considered a cluster. It's considered just the F note is repeated, just the high note is repeated. If I bring that up again, then it is considered a cluster. Now, these 3, including this invisible one, which we'll come to in a minute, determine when synchronic actually happens. So this one lets you determine if synchronic happens depending on how big your chord is. So if we set the minimum to 2, for example, then any 1 note I play, any single note, will not trigger synchronic. But when I play 2 notes, then synchronic is triggered all the way up to 12. But I can set this down to, can make the minimum 2 and the maximum 3, so only 2 and 3 note chords will trigger synchronic. Then 4 note chord, nothing happens. 1 note chord, or 1 note on a chord. And you can also set the minimum to higher than the maximum. So here, let's bring it down so that the minimum is 2, the maximum is 2, and the minimum is 3, which is confusing. Which means that a one note, single note, it'll be repeated. 2 notes, it'll be repeated. Oh, I have to make that 4. 2 notes, it's repeated. 4 notes, it's repeated, but 3 notes, nothing happens. So you can make this little sweet spot for yourself where nothing happens. So we'll skip this invisible one for a second and move down to velocity min-max, which is the exact same concept as cluster min-max, but instead of amount of notes played in a chord, it's volume. So if we bring the minimum up, then quieter notes won't trigger synchronic, but louder notes will. And the same with this, where you can bring the maximum down, you can bring the minimum over the maximum and give yourself a sweet spot. So jumping up, pulse triggered by. This whole menu refers to clusters, so let's just bring the cluster threshold up a bunch. So first note on means that the first note I play is what triggers the synchronic function in a given cluster. And you'll notice that when I play that cluster, those 3 notes, do, da, do, that took place in the span of 1,160 milliseconds. Every time I played a new note in that chord, the note was sucked into the pulse that the first note generated. While I played those notes off the beat, they got kind of sucked into the pulse. When you make it any note on, then each new note you play will start a new pulse. I'll show that again. Notice how the pulse kind of slows down and starts again whenever I play a new note. First note off, as I'm sure you can imagine, the synchronic repeated notes are triggered by the first note that you take off in a chord. So it only happened when I released the G. And nothing happens when I release the other notes. But if you make it any note off, then it's the same function. Nothing happens until I release the G. But when I release the other notes, the pulse is shifted over to when I release those notes, just like an any note on. And last note off, the pulse is triggered by the last note that I take off. That's a cool one. And this, the key on, key off determines cluster. So let's make it key off. Now there's only these 3. That means that the cluster is actually now determined by when I release the notes, not when I press the notes down. When it's key on, the cluster threshold happens when I play the notes. You'll see this blue line will appear. When it's key off, nothing's happening here. When I release the notes, that's when the timing begins and the cluster is determined. So let's bring it back to key on, and you'll notice that when we're in last note off or any note off, we have hold min-max. And that, if you'll remember, is the same concept as velocity and cluster min-max, but instead of loudness or amount of notes, it's how long you hold a note for. So if we bring the minimum up a little bit, then kind of staccato notes, well, let's bring it down a little bit. Staccato notes don't trigger synchronic, but longer notes do. That's a cool function. All right, moving on to our next page. Not that page, but this page. So there are 4 things here, and they all do some very fun, crazy business. So the first one, transpositions, before I even talk about it, let's just do some random things and see what happens. Woo! Oh. Well, let's make the period a little longer. Wow, that's pretty crazy. So transpositions takes the note you play and transposes it. So instead of the same note repeating every time, different notes are repeated. And as you saw, you can drag, and that'll give you decimal points. So for example, this one, 7.22, is 7.22 equally tempered half steps, 7 and 22 1/100ths, or 11/50ths of a equally tempered half step. If you want it all to be equally tempered, you do shift drag. You'll see I'm dragging while holding down the shift button, and it's all whole numbers. So you'll hear that sounds more like an equally tempered piano. You can drag, you can shift drag, and you can also double click and write in values. So let's say I want to get a chromatic scale. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just until there. So I play a note. So you can do that. You can write in numbers. You can also write in numbers that aren't equally tempered. 1.5. Here, let's make it 1, 2.5, 7, and then 15. Cool. All right, moving on to accents. Let's do the same thing where we just kind of play with it and then see what happens. So as you can see, this messes with pretty much how loud each note is. It allows you to accent notes. And again, you can write in values, and you can also drag. 1 is the same volume as the note we had. So let's say 1, 1.1, that'll be quiet. And then 3, that'll be much louder. And then 3, and then 0.1. Kind of a waltz. Cool. The next one is, let's get rid of that, is sustained length multiplier. So again, let's see what happens. Whoa. What's happening with that? So sustained length multipliers actually does 2 things. Positive numbers, well, it does one thing, but in 2 ways. Let's start with positive numbers. So positive numbers, so let's write 0.2, so let's write 1.2, 2.2. So it determines how long each note lasts for. 0.2 is a very short note, 2 is a long note. You can also make the numbers negative, and that makes the note it plays the note backwards. And also, the closer to 0 it is, the shorter the note, and the farther away from 0, the longer the note. So let's do 1, or 0, which is, let's do 1, which is a normal length forwards note, and then negative 0.2, negative 2.2. That's a pretty cool one. And again, you can write in or you can drag. Beat length multipliers. Let's see what happens here. Cool. So this one finally is breaking up our metronome. Before this, everything we played was just do, 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 just a simple beat, like a metronome. But beat length multipliers lets you change how long each note lasts for. So, you can make them all really, really short. We can do this. That's pretty cool. And you can make the number of pulses much longer, so that can really last for longer. That's pretty cool. And then you can throw in, one long guy over there. That's pretty fun. And again, with this one, you can write in values, or you can drag. And with this one and with these other three, 1 is normal. 1 is how you play it, and then you can move it around from there. I'll show you what these little refresh looking buttons do, the circles. So let's say I set up this pattern with beat length multipliers. If I press this, the pattern moves over 1. And move over again. See that bottom note, that bottom fast note is moving over 1. So that's a pretty fun thing you can do. You can also do skip first. Here, I'll show you in transposition. So let's do a shift drag. We'll get that. But if I want the first note I play to actually be the downbeat, instead of I play a note and then there's the downbeat over here, then I press skip first. So without skip first, with skip first, there's also the use tuning function, and this is in nostalgic as well. Very briefly, if we're in there's a different video about tuning that you should totally watch, but I'll just do a brief run through. If we're in equal temperament, which is where we usually are, here, let's get rid of synchronic for a second. Equal temperament, beautiful. That's where we normally are, but let's say we go to utonal. Very different sound, and we want that to be represented in the transpositions part of synchronic. Then we press use tuning, because right now if I do shift drag, let's say I do 0, 4, 7 major triad. That's an equally tempered major triad, but I'm in utonal tuning, so if I want it to be a utonal major triad, then now the temperament is represented in the integers in transposition. But let's get rid of that. Let's go back to equal temperament. Just a few more things on this page. In transpositions, you can write in numbers, 1, 3, 4, whatever. You can also write brackets and get clusters, square brackets. So let's say I want a major chord, so 0, 4, 7, 12. So I play it. Now you get a cluster. You can also write some. So here you can see there's a cluster and there's a normal note. You can do that. You can also write some pretty crazy clusters. My favorite thing to do is to make this spaceship sound where you put a whole lot of notes very close to each other. You get this crazy thing. Whoa. Pretty freaking cool. You can also point somewhere with your cursor and do control click add transposition, and that'll add a note here. So, or I want to add another note right there. Control click right there, add transposition, and we got another note. Very cool, very cool. All right, so that is pretty much, okay, we're going to use tuning. That's pretty much this page. There are just a few more things left in synchronic, a few odds and ends. So you'll notice this little red button that's been sitting here the whole time. Let's press that and see what happens. Oh, attack, decay, sustain, release. So this is the Adsr window of synchronic. ADSR refers to pretty much what happens when you play a note. There's the attack portion of the note, the decay, the sustain, and the release. That's what happens when in any given note. And you can learn more about this online in different resources, but this page allows you to mess with the ADSR parameters just within synchronic. So if I bring attack time all the way up, that's what that sounds like. You can do more exploring about this on your own, but that's a nice thing to have. Okay, close. Cool. Very cool, very cool. So the last part of this video will be showing how the tempo can be altered when working with synchronic. So to start with that, we have to press action add tempo, or M for the M in tempo, or for metronome. And we'll link that up to synchronic. And we'll see that, that right now that repeated note is at 120 BPM, but that can be moved. Now it's faster, make it slower, or go back to 120 BPM. You can change the subdivisions. So those are quarter notes at 120 BPM. Well, let's give us a little more space. So 1, that's a quarter note. 2 is an eighth note. Triplet. You can also make it a half note. So that's a really great way to mix everything up. Before this, we had a consistent tempo, and the only parameter we had to move things around with the time was the beat length multiplier. But now we can also change the underlying tempo, which is great. And briefly, I'll just point out that there's also adaptive tempo, which we have to attach the key map to the metronome to do that. But adaptive tempo is pretty much, instead of setting a tempo like we did before, bitKlavier follows how fast you're playing something and sets a tempo. So you'll see as I slow down, bitKlavier slows down, or as I speed up. As I speed up, bitKlavier speeds up. Uh-oh. Get out of here. Anyway, that will be covered in a later video in more depth, but yeah, that's synchronic for you. This page, our ADSR guy. This page, the metronome. Beautiful. So much cool stuff to work with. Thanks for watching.